Chelsea call in the lawyers over allegations the club paid hush money to a young player, claiming sex abuse in the 70s. The Premier League leaders are the latest big-name club to be drawn into the crisis facing football.
The FA should tell clubs that they must tear up these confidentiality agreements to allow the victims of abuse to come forward and share their stories.
Also this lunchtime, a mental health care scandal. NHS trusts in England cut back on beds and send patients miles for treatment. It could be you. The National Lottery admits thousands of its online accounts have been hacked. And the staggering cost to the nation of those who just can't get a good night's sleep.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Alistair Stewart.
Good afternoon. Chelsea, the current Premier League leaders, are the latest club to become embroiled in allegations of historic sex abuse of young footballers. It's called in the lawyers to investigate claims that surround one of its employees in the 1970s. Some reports suggest the club secretly paid off a former youth team player who was threatening to make his story public. Meanwhile, North Wales Police has become the latest force to confirm they are investigating allegations boys were abused by the coaches they trusted. Richard Pallow has the latest.
It is the most high-profile club yet to be dragged into this ever-widening net. Allegations that a former Chelsea youth player who was in their care was sexually abused by one of their employees. There are reports that the club paid the alleged victim to keep quiet when he threatened to go public 3 years ago. Chelsea have now appointed a law firm to look into an individual employed by the club in the 1970s. It is believed to be Eddie Heath, their chief scout at the time. He is now deceased. Former Chelsea and England footballer Ray Wilkins was taught by Heath for many years when he was a child.
I knew Eddie for a long, long time. I joined Chelsea when I was 10 and a half, and I had the pleasure of meeting him then. So yeah, I would say my childhood at Chelsea was an extremely happy one, along with a lot of other guys there as well. So naturally I was surprised last night, yeah.
But ITV News has spoken to another former Chelsea youth player who says, "I'm not surprised about the developments. There were always rumours about Heath and I felt uncomfortable in his company." The Football Association abandoned a flagship programme into the protection of children in 2003. They've yet to explain why. They're also under pressure to extend their internal review into historical abuse and open a full investigation. One stumbling block might be the confidentiality agreements signed between clubs and alleged victims. But this MP told me the FA should compel the clubs to rip them up.
The FA should tell clubs that they must tear up these confidentiality agreements to allow the victims of abuse to come forward and share their stories. And I think the FA should make absolutely clear that if clubs refuse to do that, and they're found to have not done that, that the FA will take sanctions within the game against those clubs.
In just a week, the NSPCC has received 800 calls to its historic football abuse helpline. And with probes now opened by North Wales Police and North Yorkshire Police, there are currently 11 forces across the UK involved. Richard Pallow, ITV News.
Sports correspondent Ian Payne joins us live there at Stamford Bridge. So lots of clubs, Ian, like Chelsea, have called in lawyers to investigate these matters. The FA say they will make their findings public. Will that be the same for the clubs?
Well, you know, that's a really interesting question. I've been trying to contact Chelsea all morning, but I haven't been able to get any more comment other than the statement. Just to give a little bit more detail to that statement that Richard Pallow was referring to, they said last night they've retained an outside law firm to carry out a full investigation concerning an individual employed by the club in the 1970s who's now deceased. The club have also contacted the FA to ensure that all possible assistance is provided as part of their wider investigation, and they say they won't be making any more comment than that. The FA yesterday and their chairman, Martin Glenn, was at pains to reassure everyone that they will be as transparent as they can. Now, is that going to be the same with clubs that are getting embroiled now, like Crewe Alexandra and now Chelsea?
Ian, thank you. ITV News has discovered more than half of mental health trusts in England have cut the number of beds for patients in crisis despite the government promising extra funding. We sent a Freedom of Information request to all of the country's mental health trusts. Of those that responded, 60% have cut the number of beds available. Well, it was our health editor, Rachel Younger, who sent that request for information. Tell us more you found.
Well, as you know, NHS England is under enormous financial pressure, yet despite the Prime Minister personally saying she wanted to make mental health a priority, what we found here is evidence that frontline services are still being hit. 60% of mental health trusts in England telling us they had cut beds, and we also found very little evidence that the savings they were making were going into community-based care, which is what's meant to be happening. Instead, to give you one example, Barnet Mental Health Trust in North London admitted to having to cut 21 beds this year, and one patient was sent 233 miles from home when no beds were available. Further north, Pennine NHS Trust cut 28 beds. It sent one patient 222 miles away to get treatment, again when beds were full. And at Cambridge and Peterborough NHS Foundation Trust, 13 beds were cut. The longest distance a patient had to travel for treatment there was 177 miles. And remember, this government has pledged to totally eradicate these kind of long journeys by 2021. Now, Nick Clegg was right at the forefront of efforts to try and get mental health parity, if you like, with the treatment we get for physical conditions. He's been slow so far to criticise the government, but in the light of these figures, he told us he thinks important promises are now being broken.
We introduced a big shift during the time of the coalition, not only about how government talked about mental health, but also making very significant announcements about extra money for mental health, making sure it was a legal requirement to put mental health on the same footing as physical health, to elevate the importance particularly of mental health services for children and adolescents. So to hear 2, 3, 4 years down the line that it's just simply not happening in practice is, in my view, a real betrayal.
You're the expert. Does this speak to a wider set of problems within the NHS England?
I think it does. NHS England have said that their investment in mental health is rising faster than in any other service. 400 million for crisis resolution teams. That's all very well. But what we're seeing is beds being cut before that help's in place. So it really is difficult to get help at the moment.
Rachel, thank you. The Royal Bank of Scotland, rescued by the taxpayer in the wake of the last financial crisis, is the worst prepared of the UK's high street banks to cope with another. The Bank of England conducted what it called stress tests and told RBS to boost its finances and strengthen its balance sheet. It is a disappointment for the state-owned bank, still struggling to recover, as Joanna Partridge reports.
RBS, the bank we still own 73% of, and the weakest in the pack of British lenders. It's failed the yearly health check carried out by the Bank of England. RBS would need an extra £2 billion of capital to survive another financial crisis. Part of RBS's problem is it's paying the price for past wrongdoing.
There's misconduct costs, there's impaired assets, they're still working through the so-called non-core assets on which they have made progress, and they have made progress over the course of the year.
RBS wasn't the only bank that wasn't resilient enough. Barclays and Standard Chartered also fell short in some areas. The Bank of England checked to see if lenders could withstand a shock to the domestic and global economy. A 30% fall in UK house prices, a spike in the unemployment rate, a sharp drop in the oil price to $20 a barrel, and a contraction in the Chinese economy.
This is the toughest UK stress test that's been performed to date. And I think that, combined with the higher pass mark, has made it not only challenging for RBS but also a number of other UK institutions.
The government bailed out RBS in 2008. Since then, the bank's lost over £50 billion and is expected to make a loss again this year. With today's stress test failure, the government may need even longer than anticipated to get rid of its stake in RBS. The Bank of England's tests began in March and looked at the state of the banks at the end of 2015. That was before Britain voted to leave the EU. Today, the bank also looked to the wider economy since the referendum. There are warnings that next year prices will rise faster than wages and we'll see a squeeze on living standards.
Debt is relatively high still. And households have been running down their savings, and we're starting to see for the first time a re-leveraging of households. In other words, the level of household debt is going up.
This lunchtime, food for thought for consumers and banks alike. we should get our houses in order to cope with any future Brexit shocks to the economy. Joanna Partridge, ITV News.
Hackers have accessed the online accounts of more than 26,000 National Lottery players in the latest security breach to hit UK consumers. The National Lottery said it became aware of suspicious activity on players' accounts on Monday and has suspended those affected. Well, our consumer editor Chris Choi joins me live with the details. How have people been affected?
Well, there's quite a lot of detail to work you through, but this morning that old phrase, "it could be you," meant something completely different. Not encouraging, but an urgent warning, because the lottery organisers have warned everybody that uses their site to change their passwords. They've said, in terms of the direct impact, that no money has been taken, nor have full bank details. But there is still, nevertheless, a problem. Let me just take you through what they have told us this lunchtime. Here on the graphic, 26,500 players are affected. Their email addresses and National Lottery passwords have been stolen. And of those, around 50 have experienced activity on their accounts which is potentially suspicious. Those affected have been told to alert their banks to be vigilant for unauthorised transactions as a precaution after all this has happened. I've spoken to Camelot, who organised the lottery. They say they think these details were taken from another site and then used on their site. In other words, as usual, we're using the same passwords on multiple sites.
Same old problem. Chris, thank you. And on our website, there's more on that story, plus details of how you can protect yourself, as Chris just suggested, and indeed your money from online activity. That is itv.com/news. Still to come, a happy divorce, why lawyers have gone to Parliament to ask for separations to be less aggressive. And a happy ending to a desperate online search for a child's beaker. But first, the number of victims of online sextortion has more than doubled in the last year. More and more criminals are using young girls to lure men into video sex chats, then blackmailing them for cash, with threats of posting the videos on social media. 4 men have committed suicide since last summer after being preyed upon by the scammers. Jenny Longdon reports.
I noticed that you're kind of cute.
She may look like she just wants a bit of online fun, but this campaign highlights that girls asking for explicit webcam footage may be the face of a criminal network, luring people into exposing themselves.
You're being blackmailed. Your contacts have been downloaded. The film will be shared with your friends, your family,
everyone you know.
Unless you pay.
Wayne May runs a website to help the growing numbers of people targeted in this way. While he hasn't been the victim of such a scam himself, he has seen firsthand the devastating impact it can have on those targeted.
We get a lot of people come in to us and say, if the video ever gets leaked, I will kill myself. So we know it's something that people are considering when this happens to them. And I say we know from the past that people have done this before.
The numbers of men reporting offences like these in the UK are on the rise. In 2011, there were just 9 reported incidents. That figure rose to 385 in 2015, just a year on, and the number has doubled to 864.
In the last year, there have been 4 young people that have been so desperate and find themselves in such an appalling situation when they're blackmailed in this way that they've chosen to take their own lives as the route out of that situation.
Police advice to victims of online blackmail is not to pay or communicate. They expect reports of so-called sextortion to rise as they encourage more victims to come forward. Jenny Longdon, ITV News.
Now, more than 100 lawyers are lobbying Parliament today to demand the weakening, as it were, of divorce rules. They're protesting for a no-fault divorce to make it easier for couples to separate. As it stands, some couples are lying about their circumstances just in order to speed up the process, something that Natasha Britton did when she split up from her husband 4 years ago.
My ex-husband had a business that obviously he was protective of, and his and his name in the industry, and he felt that if anybody wanted it, he didn't want to be known as an adulterer, or put down as an adulterer. So I said, well, I'll put my hand up for it. If it saves us, just tick the box, the adultery box, because it just seemed the easiest way.
Now, currently, a natural breakdown of a marriage isn't reasons for divorce. You must prove one of the following: that either one of you has, as she was just telling us, committed adultery, that your spouse has behaved in such a way that you cannot reasonably be expected to live with him or her, that your spouse has deserted you for at least 2 years, that you've consensually been living apart for at least 2 years, or that you have lived apart for more than 5 years, even if your husband or wife disagrees with the divorce. Well, joining me now is family lawyer Joe Edwards, and formerly of Resolution Lawyers, trying to guide people through divorce. There is a school of thought that will say you're simply trying to make what is a tragedy easier.
Lots of people do misinterpret Resolution's campaign as trying to make divorce easier. What we say is we want to make divorce kinder. There are 115,000 divorces that happen in this country every year. Most people don't realise until they come to see somebody like myself that in the majority of those cases, if they want to move forward with the divorce at pace, they have to apportion blame. So around 2/3 of divorces do proceed on that basis at present. The difficulty with that is it creates conflict from the get-go. So in circumstances where we're trying to encourage a conciliatory approach, a lot of my practice is mediation, for example, it makes it terribly difficult, and there's conflict which ultimately impacts upon the children.
Absolutely crucial, and as I warned you before, I would play devil's advocate. Yes. I mean, equally, some would say, well, try and make it work. If you win this argument with the MPs and they change primary legislation, marriage could simply become a disposable convenience.
That I don't agree with, and one of the reasons we don't agree with that is if one looks at the experience of other countries, so Scotland, for example, they changed the divorce law 10 years ago. They reduced the amount of time you had to be separated from 2 years to 1 if there was consent, and a result of that is that 95% of cases in Scotland now proceed without blame being apportioned. There was a very short-term spike in the number of divorces, but it's levelled off again.
Finally, and genuinely briefly, did you sense that English MPs might agree with their Scottish counterparts?
We very much hope that that's the case. Lots of MPs are meeting with their Resolution constituents in Parliament today. There's a growing groundswell of opinion that the law needs to change.
Crucial debate. Joe, thank you very much indeed. Next, how one family's search for a simple cup caught the world's attention and has led to a happy ending. Earlier this month, Mark Carter from Devon made an appeal on social media because he was trying to find a particular beaker for his 14-year-old son, Ben. Now, Ben has autism and will only drink out of that sort of cup, which hasn't been produced in 10 years. So he asked for help, and what a difference it's made. Now, the manufacturer has agreed to make another 500 cups for Ben, and I've been speaking to Dad Mark at his home in Torrington. He explained how his message made such a huge difference.
I didn't know what to do. I've searched everywhere, and out of some random desperation, I decided to go on Twitter. No idea why, because I don't have any followers, but I decided to send a desperation tweet out.
And how far did it reach?
Geographically, around the world 12 times, I think. But millions of people, I guess. The original tweet's been retweeted 20,000 times, but some of the Facebook messages have been shared 500,000 times plus, and it's just gone crazy.
I mean, crazy indeed, but the one that really mattered was when the original manufacturer kicked in and said, hang on a moment, we think we can help.
Well, to start with, they came along very early. I think a lot of people gave them quite a lot of grief, actually, and said, you need to help. And bless them, they get some messages, but not as many as they got in the next 24 hours. And they took over my social media because I was getting 50 tweets a minute at one stage. I couldn't keep up. But then, since then, they've been taking the cups in for me and sending them on to me and doing just so much more. They didn't have to, but they offered to help as much as they could.
And you said a moment ago, I mean, your son is autistic and therefore the non-verbal communication, but now he's got what he wants. Is that just job done, or do you sense that there's a genuine excitement as well?
Ben doesn't understand any of it. Ben can only ever know there's one cup. If he saw two, as he did the other day when we tried to swap the base of the cup, he rejected it and he didn't drink for nearly 24 hours. So we couldn't convince him it was his original cup. So as far as Ben's concerned, nothing's happened. He doesn't know why there's a camera in his living room every other day. He doesn't understand why I've been busy. It's just Ben's just getting on with life, really.
And we wish Ben and Mark all the best with that, getting on with life. Now, finally, what price a good night's sleep? A group of researchers have been investigating just how much a lack of shut-eye costs the UK, and they've come up with an eye-watering estimate, £40 billion. Suzanne Verdi has the numbers.
It's official. Too little sleep can kill you. According to a new report, anyone getting less than 6 hours shut-eye a night on average are 13% more likely to die sooner than those getting 7 to 9 hours sleep.
And a lack of sleep is correlated with negative health outcomes over the long run, for instance like cancer, cardiovascular disease or strokes or diabetes. So many bad health outcomes are related to a lack of sleep.
And it's not just bad for our health, it's bad for the economy. Scientists found sleep deprivation hit productivity in the workplace, wiping £40 billion off the UK economy each year.
People who sleep less than, for instance, 6 hours are more likely to get a common cold, they're more likely to develop mental health problems over time, which leaves them off work because they might just not show up to work. But at the same time, people may come to work but are not as productive as they should be.
But how easy is it to sleep?
That all depends because I've got a little 2-year-old. So on a good night, 8 hours, 6 to 8.
No, I never get enough sleep.
How many hours do you get a night?
Probably 4 hours.
People fall asleep in meetings a few times.
And have you managed to nudge their elbow?
Nudge your elbow or a quick kick under the desk. That does a job.
There is some good news. The UK is not the most bleary-eyed nation in the world. We're ahead of America and Japan, and by upping our sleep by just an hour or so a night could improve our lifespan and the nation's finances by around £24 billion. Suzanne Verdi, ITV News.
And that is it this lunchtime. Mark Austin and Ranveer Singh will be here with the ITV Evening News at 6:30. But for now, from all of us here, bye-bye.